Right. Welcome, everyone. Future Work Scotland. Great to see you all. I'm your host for this session, Sathpal SIngh. Everybody calls me Sath. I'm joined by my co-host, Donald Henderson. And if this is your first time with us, very warm welcome to you. If you've been with us before, warm welcome back. Just the usual formalities. We do have a code of conduct. In short, we simply ask that you're respectful to one another and everyone have a great time, great experience. We'll do the usual community shout-outs at the end. I'm delighted to be joined by Esther Derby today. Delighted to have Esther back. I kind of connected with Esther early in the year when we were doing the Agile Reflect Festival. Esther was one of our wonderful patrons, and it was great to do Esther's interview back then. So really glad she's agreed to join us for this session. Esther's got an incredible history in the industry. She almost needs no introduction. I think it's 4 decades worth of experience to draw upon. And I think you've done multiple roles. And of course, Esther is the author of 2 books. Donald's holding up one of my favorites, Agile Retrospectives, which is obviously, in my view, a seminal text within the industry, and our most recent one, which is subject and topic of discussion for this evening. Evening here for us anyway. Whatever so you have, morning or afternoon. And with that, I'm gonna hand over to Esther to kick off proceedings. We are going to keep it quite interactive, small group. So yeah, use the chat to drop questions in if you want us to relay them back to Esther, but I'm sure Esther will stop at suitable points and lead me in, and you can unmute and have a little chat with Esther.
Yes, so I am hoping that we can have this more of a conversation than me talking for an hour. So I want to add a little bit to the biography, which is that I started my professional career as a programmer. I don't know how many of you knew that, but I do have programming in my past. And the first job I had was doing some programming for a small light manufacturing place, and we worked very hard to automate estimating. So they had a guy who did all their estimating, scratching things on the back of an envelope and talking to the people on the factory floor and on the phone with customers, and we automated it. It was one of the first programs that I wrote professionally. And I happened to overhear a conversation the night before the program was going to go live. And the estimator was a guy, in his 50s, he'd been working there a long time, was not happy. And he agreed that the program was accurate, and he agreed that it was faster than he could do it, and he hated it. He absolutely hated that program because it was going to change his work completely. He was no longer going to be on the phone and going down to the shop floor and scratching things out and, having conversations. He was going to be sitting at a desk, still on the phone from time to time, but mostly sitting at a desk punching numbers into a computer. And that was when I realized that even though everything about my job description said programming and code and analysis and design, my job involved change, because I was changing the way people did their work. And that's when I started paying close attention to change. And I've continued paying attention to change. I eventually went to work for a bigger company, and I got to see how change works and doesn't work in larger companies. And since that time, most of my work in one way or another involves changing something about an organization. So I wrote the book that Donald held up, 7 Rules for Positive Productive Change. Out of my experience and out of my research and theory on how change actually works in organizations. And it's written as 7 rules. I'm going to see if I can get this thing to work the way I want it to. Ah, look, it's working the way I want it to. So it's written as 7 rules, which are actually heuristics. But I mean, who's going to buy a book that says, 7 heuristics? No one. 7 rules, they'll buy. So anyway, these are heuristics that guide change. Now, heuristics are sort of like rules of thumb. They're guides for problem solving. They don't promise an answer, but they help you remember your resources and remember what you can do to solve the problems that are in front of you in change. So that's how the book is organized, and that's how the talk is organized. So what I'm hoping we can do is, I'll talk a little bit about one of the heuristics or rules, and then we can have a little conversation. You can ask questions, and so it's not just the whole time. So does that sound reasonable? Yeah. Okay.
Fantastic.
So the first rule. Oh, and I should add that these I'm going to talk about them in order because you have to talk about things in order for it to make any sense. But you don't necessarily do them in order. I mean, it's you choose the heuristic based on the sort of situation that's in front of you. Except for this first one, which I think is always a good place to start and often a good place to come back to. So the first rule is strive for congruence, because it's the foundation of integrity and open communication in times of change and pretty much any other time you're involved with human beings. So when I use the term congruence, I'm using it in the sense that in every interaction, you have to attend to 3 basic areas. And you have to attend to your own wants and needs, capabilities, desires, fears, the wants, needs, desires, and fears of the people you're working with, and then the context that you share. And they don't have to be perfectly in balance, but roughly in balance. It's hard for anything to be perfect, but you have to consider what's going on for you, what's going on for the other people, and what the context is. And then you can access your best problem solving, and you can make decisions that take into account what's going on for other folks. So I had a conversation a while ago with someone who was really upset that people were resisting his ideas. And so I asked him a bunch of questions, and it turned out that everybody agreed that what he was suggesting was actually a pretty good idea, but they were in the middle of a huge release. And they just didn't have time to step back and think about it and figure out all the details of what they needed to do and to actually go on the learning curve involved with this change. So he was thinking about his needs, to have his idea accepted. He was thinking about the context, this is a long-term problem, but he was ignoring the people he was working with who are under an enormous pressure and just really could not find the capacity to address this idea at this time. So had he considered that, he might have brought his idea up at another time where people would be more receptive to it. Right. So consider your own wants and needs, those of the organization and those of the people you're working with. And it's never perfect. I think about it like being on a wobble board where, you're always making this kind of little tiny adjustment so you can remain upright. But if you don't, then you tilt in one direction or another, you lose your ability to balance and respond to the situation you're in. So that's the very first rule. And I think in some ways it's the fundamental one, because when you are in this state of congruence, you are more likely to be able to listen to people with empathy. You're better able to connect to your own internal state, which helps you not take on stuff that is too much, or it helps you maintain your alignment to your values, but you're also keeping what the goal is for the organization in mind. So who has a question or a comment about this notion of striving for congruence and change and why it matters? Any questions or comments?
Nothing in nothing in the chat. I don't see anything. If somebody's going. Well, you got a question? Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So what communication channels, because you have to communicate to come to this shared understanding, shared minds. Do you feel that there's no best, but how do you sort of navigate what the right fit of types of communications, frequency of communications to achieve the congruence?
Well, I think congruence is something that happens in yourself, right? But in order to understand what's going on for other people, you have to engage with them, observe, and talk to them, ideally, to understand what's going on. I think very often people, when they are in a situation where they've been asked to change something, we hear all this talk about driving change, right? So people tend to want to communicate outwards, but they don't necessarily put as much emphasis on listening, right? So listening is actually an important part of communication. So listening to what's going on for people.
So this is really more about self-awareness and sort of situational awareness from understanding other perspectives. Yeah.
Okay. And then you use many forms of communication. You've written and spoken and ephemeral and all sorts of communication, because people need to hear things multiple times to absorb them. And as you listen to people, you may change your message. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a question to add on to that.
Sure.
It sounds like it's more about creating that shared understanding and awareness of kind of your own self, others, and how this may impact them, and then kind of that shared context, the environment is more of that versus coming to a consensus.
Congruence is a personal state, right? It's a personal state where you are in balance and therefore able to, as I said, to access your best thinking. It may lead to consensus, right? It may lead to, as you listen to other people, as you understand what's going on for them, as you have conversations about why it is important to make a change, what the outcome that's desired is, you may come to a consensus that says, oh yeah, we need to tweak this a little bit, or oh yeah, we understand that this makes sense. But it really has to do with where you're standing from personally. And what I have found is that, when I can maintain this, and I'm never perfect at it, that's why it says strive for rather than be, I find that I'm more able to be calm and respond in a calm way, which in times of change is very reassuring to people. Right. Having one person who is calm can spread just as having one person who is, fearful or angry or anxious can spread. Did that help?
Yeah, it did.
Yeah, great.
Esther, what I'm hearing is unconditional positive regard needs to, be on the table for everybody and be practiced by everybody for this to work.
Well, I can be congruent even if someone in the other part of the room isn't.
Yeah.
Right. So I think when you can increase congruence.
Yeah.
Right. If you can help other people access these things, understanding themselves, the context, and the other people they're working with, then of course it's going to be much more effective. But I can try to hold on to my congruence no matter what else is going on in the room. It's not always easy. If someone's screaming at you, it's not necessarily, it takes some practice to kind of just stay calm and say, well, what's going on for you right now? Instead of, screaming back or leaving the room. And sometimes when someone's screaming, leaving the room is exactly the right thing to do. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go to the next one, assuming I can get my technology to work for me. Yippee. Honor the past, present, and people. I think this is another one that is easy to gloss over. But paradoxically, paying attention to the past helps people let go of it. You know, very often we're very enthusiastic about a change, particularly, you know, maybe not so much anymore, but certainly in the early days of Agile, people were really enthusiastic about it. And they were like, oh, we have to do this. It's wonderful. It's good. And the effect that that sometimes has on people is that it makes them feel like, you're saying that what we have been doing for a long time was wrong. I think particularly the title that some people have of evangelist implies that, you know, because what do evangelists do? They come to save you from the darkness and bring you the light, right? Which sort of implies what you have been doing is wrong. So I think acknowledging that people were doing the best they could, given what they had, and given that the process they're now using is probably something that they're, you know, some manager a few years ago told them to do. I think it's really important to acknowledge what is working. You know, what has worked, what was valuable about the past that we want to save, what is working now that we want to continue, and that people have been really putting forward effort and doing the best they could, right? When people feel like something's being yanked away from them or they're being pushed into something, that's when people hold on tighter. Much of the time when people do not embrace a change with the enthusiasm and speed desired, it's because they've been pushed or they feel like they're going to lose something. So, you know, that's what people do. They hold on, you know, even if it's not good, it's theirs, right? And that is often preferable to having someone from the outside come in and impose something on them. So this also ties back to congruence so that you can be empathetic. And this doesn't mean you have to fix the situation for people. It doesn't mean you have to, you know, make everybody feel happy. But, you know, acknowledge what is going on and acknowledge that there is always a negative space with change. There's always a loss with change. And recognize that, yeah, it is going to be potentially difficult. Yeah, we are going to let go of some things. And this is why we need to move forward, because what we're doing now worked in the past, but it's not going to meet our future challenges. So it's one of those paradoxical things, right? You have to actually acknowledge this for people to be willing to move forward. And when you do it, very often that resistance just kind of dissipates because people feel heard, they feel listened to, feel understood. And when they feel that way, they are much more likely to reciprocate and listen to what you have to say. So honor the past, the present, and people.
Can I take some questions on that?
Yeah.
All right. Any questions for Esther on that one, folks?
I'm very curious about this statement that it's available online at Lego.
Oh, in the chat.
Yeah. Don't know if that's authorized or not.
Any questions for Esther on this one, folks? Will we move on to the next rule? Yeah.
I would just say that this, in my experience, this one's been really important, you know, kind of the way I come and frame it up, that conversation is like, you know, what we have been doing, or if I'm a client, you know, what you have been doing and are doing is not necessarily wrong or bad. It's like Esther said, it's enabled us to get to where we are now.
Yeah.
But it's also unlikely to take us where we want to go next.
Yeah, and sometimes what I do in that situation is I'll, well, in the before times when we could actually be together and, get out our sticky notes, I just make this big wall that says, here's what we have been dealing with historically that may be, waning now. Here's the challenges we're facing in the moment. Here's the challenges we see on our horizon.
Mm-hmm.
And then I look at it from the terms of, the market, the technology, our company, our team, whatever makes sense in the occasion. And just people write down their sticky notes and they stick them up there. And then they look at it all and it usually becomes quite clear to people that, what we are facing requires us to change if we want to stay viable. But it also acknowledges that, there has been a past. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Yeah. Who else?
Don't see any other hands up or
Okay, then I'm
waving. So I think you're good to keep going.
okay. So assess what is. Now, people think change starts with a vision, but it really starts with right where you are right now. I think this is a super important rule because I see this happen so often that people decide to put in a new process or new method and they go through all of this training and all of this work, and pretty soon they notice that nothing much has changed. Maybe the terms that people use have changed, but the pattern has reasserted itself. So it's like the results you see in any system are emerge from that system. That system is perfectly designed or has perfectly evolved to produce the results that it is currently experiencing. So if you put something on top of that, so you just lay something on top of it, and you don't address the underlying patterns, the underlying factors that cause that pattern and hold that pattern in place, it's very likely the pattern is going to reassert itself. So it's super important to understand, why are we getting the results we are getting now? And what do we need to adjust in our current environment so that something else becomes possible? Something else can take hold. So this isn't in the book because I didn't think about it till after the book was sent off to be published. But in some ways it's like forest succession. I happen to live near some very large forests. I mean, if you go north of me, it's pretty much forests up until you get to tundra. So I spend a lot of time in forests, and forests do not grow from rocky ground, right? You can't just take a rocky field and plow it up and plant trees and expect to get a forest. There's actually a very clear succession of species that happens and of transformations that happen. So you may start with some rocky ground and some weeds take hold, and those weeds, the roots will change the characteristic of the soil a little bit. They might loosen it, they might bind some more nitrogen. It might be that the tiny bit of moisture they hold in the ground allows something else to take root. And that plant might grow a little taller and create some shade, which influences the moisture in the air, which allows another species to take hold. So each one of these tiny little changes to the environment itself changes the environment and makes it more likely that something else is going to take hold. And I think that's a much more useful way to think about change in our organizations. It's like, what can we do in our current system to make it likely that something else is going to take hold? We say we want to do this big thing. Well, what can we change? What's the tiniest thing we can change that will make it more likely that will take hold? What do we have to loosen up? What do we have to put in place that will make the metaphorical soil ready for this thing we want to plant here. So an example that I see a lot is people talk about wanting collaboration, but yet all of the structures in their organization are aimed at individual performance. Job descriptions emphasize individual performance, ratings and performance reviews reinforce that. Bonuses, they all reinforce that. So what can you do? Can you loosen some of that up? Can you say that part of your rating is based on teamwork or the team's performance or the organization's performance? So think about what needs to change in the environment for something new to take hold. You have to understand what the current environment is. Now, this comes up in another way that isn't so metaphorical, but it comes out of research on education. It's called the zone of proximal development, which says that, you know, if you have someone who's learning something, they have potential, which might be out here somewhere, and they have what they can do now that might be here. So they cannot leap from what they can do now to their ultimate potential. It just doesn't work that way. It just will not work. You can't coach someone hard enough to have them leap from, I am just learning scales to, I can play Mozart. You know, it doesn't happen. What they can do is what's in the zone of proximal development, which is the next neighbor skill. It's adding some additional skills that they might be able to do with support, with coaching, with some training, with some scaffolding. Rather than taking this big leap. It's just like forests don't leap, systems don't leap, and generally people don't leap, right? So look at where you are. What's the next best thing? What's the nearest skill that you need to learn? What is the thing that will make the change possible? So I often think about this backwards. So I say, you know, we want to get to this wonderful thing out here. Well, if we were to do that, what would have to be true? And then I just back into it, you know, so we want to do Agile. What do we need to be able to do Agile? We have to be able to actually deliver an increment of software. Well, what is necessary to do that? Well, we have to have the ability to do certain engineering skills. We need to be able to do very fine grained tests. We need to be able to integrate. We need to be able to write our code in a way that it's changeable. Right? So you don't get to that in a leap. You get to that through learning a number of different skills. So it's not a vision, it's where you are right now. That's where you need to start. So Sath says, I see orgs as ecosystems. Yeah, they are. Yeah. I actually just posted a blog post on forest succession as a metaphor. So if you want to read more about how I think about it, you can check out my blog at estherderby.com. Yeah, so small steps, micro steps are much more effective for sustainable change than a big bang. Now, of course, there are some things that have to happen all at once. Like, for example, I think it was in 1967, I don't remember the exact date, but I think it was 1967 that in Sweden, they switched from driving on one side of the road to the other side of the road. And it happened in one day. It's just like, okay, on this day, everybody's going to start driving on a different side. And obviously there was a lot of planning that went into that. So it's a very complicated problem. It's not necessarily a complex problem. It's a very complicated problem that can be planned for. But very few things are like that, right? A lot of things, you know, they don't have to happen all at once. They can happen in a small incremental way. And I'm going to talk about that more in a little bit. So who else has a question about assess what is?
Esther, I guess, sorry, I've got one. I
Sure.
just wonder who would do the assessing? Because I'm sure we've all had places where the assessment's been done by people who are moving up close to a change and they think this is easy. This is
Yeah.
what we do just now. So is there multiple levels, multiple people?
Yeah, they're looking at it from 50,000 feet. So I think it has to happen at multiple levels, right? And most organizations are not monoliths, so it's very likely that there are parts of the organization where the immediate next skill is different than it is in some other part of the organization, right? So I think it has to happen at multiple levels, multiple different times. Right. And sometimes at kind of a, at a high level, it can be useful just to look at, do our policies support what we say we want to do? So at that level, you can kind of look at it at a high level often. But I think it has to happen in multiple places because, in spite of the idea that we can do big design up front for a change and somebody in a far distant department can figure it out and they'll know how it will actually work on the ground in hundreds of different parts of the organization. I mean, it's a fiction, right? So, yeah. Did that help?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
What practices or techniques do you often see here? Is it like value stream mapping, and techniques like that?
That can be helpful. That can be super helpful. So anything that helps you understand the way work flows through your organization is helpful. I often use Glenda O. Yang's Containers, Differences, and Exchanges, which is very interesting work. It's a way of looking at an organization through a complexity lens. I think I look at organizations through the C model, which is a way of looking at how concerns play out in the organization. But I think it's useful to look at the organization through multiple lenses when you do this.
Mm-hmm.
I think the one that often gets missed is I don't think a lot of people are doing either of those assessments actually, but I think very often, people don't look at the impact of the policies when they want to make a change. If all of your policies are saying, you have to ask permission, you are constrained from doing all of these things, and suddenly you want people to begin to behave in a self-managing fashion, which is a lot of what Agile calls for with, bounded autonomy for teams. Some things would be super obvious if people just looked at their policies.
Mm-hmm.
Do I think that sometimes it is possible to leap in a Eureka moment? I think that happens for individuals. It's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about it quite that way. I think that happens for individuals when suddenly they have an understanding that totally shifts the way they look at something. But that Eureka moment is very often not so much this, sudden idea. It's a bunch of smaller ideas and insights that finally combine together to create that feeling of a Eureka. And that's also true when organizations seem to jump. It's the confluence of, a multitude of small changes that come together to create this sense that something has tipped or jumped. In the US, we saw that with testing in schools, which hadn't been super emphasized. I mean, we had tests, obviously, but it hadn't been super emphasized until there was this confluence of factors, many of them policies, that suddenly tipped the whole system into this whole regime of, high stakes testing all the time. But it felt sudden in some ways, but it was actually, if you look at it, the whole bunch of factors came together that made that possible. So if you can get a bunch of people to make a Eureka moment, have that kind of Eureka insight at the same time, then I think it's more likely you'll see something that looks like, a big shift or a big tipping point. There's some really interesting work by, probably won't pronounce his name properly, Gervais C. Bush. He's Canadian. And Robert Marshak did some work on dialogic OD, where their thesis is that, you know, if people get together and talk and have conversations about, guided in some way about the way they're doing things and the challenges they're facing, and, you know, have some new ideas inserted about what could happen, that can actually create that shift, because that's creating the Eureka moment over and over again for a bunch of different people. It may not feel like a Eureka, but it is over time, their understanding shifts. So I'm going to press on, if I can get my technology to work. Okay, attend to networks. Work happens through webs of relationships in most organizations, and networks are a really important way to diffuse ideas in organizations. So if you can tap into the respect networks or the expertise networks in your organization, and the people in those networks agree that what you're doing is a good idea, you have just made your job a whole lot easier. Right, and these exist in every single organization. The trick is to figure out what they are, and you know who's in that network. There's a lot of software you can use in conjunction with questionnaires to get people to kind of talk about who they seek advice from, who they trust for expertise. And if you can tap into that, it's going to make your effort much easier. On the other hand, if the people in the trust networks think it's a bad idea, you're going to struggle. It's going to be really hard. You can weave networks, which is something that I am very intentional about when I am working with organizations on change. Like, you know, who is working on something that looks similar to something that's working over here? Can I figure out a way for those people to meet each other? I might do lean coffees or something like that, so that people in different parts of the organization that might be working on something similar can come together and begin to hear that something else is going on. So actually intentionally weave those networks. You also have to be careful not to break networks, which is what happens in a lot of reorganizations. Networks are broken, and then it's very difficult for people to get work done. Excuse me, until those networks are rebuilt. So, like, my husband used to work for a consulting engineering firm where they did a lot of different sorts of work for clients. Like, you know, it would come up that we're doing this work, but you know, they have this other need and we can do that. So there was a lot of kind of cross-pollination. And suddenly that work started drying up, and they figured out eventually that it was because they were growing and they converted the lunchroom into offices. And a lot of that talk about, well, what are you working on? What's going on with this client had happened when people met people from other parts of the company over lunch, or just bumped into them and say, oh, you're there, I'll sit down with you and we'll have a conversation. So that whole network was broken when they got rid of the lunchroom. And it had an impact on the company. I mean, they recovered from it eventually. And I think when they moved to their new offices, they had to reestablish the lunchroom. But you have to build networks, and you have to make sure you aren't breaking networks. So how many of you are tapped into the networks where you work? Yeah. So what do you find about being tapped into the network? Yeah, so some people feel like they are. Yeah, it is necessary. Yeah, there's a lot of energy there. One of the interesting networks that I used to see was the smokers. Because in the US, you can't smoke inside most buildings. So people, public buildings or office buildings, so people will huddle outside. And the smokers cross all parts of the organization. So they talk to people who are not just the people they work with day to day. They talk to all sorts of people from other parts of the organization. And those people knew what was going on. They always knew. And that's something that I think was really at risk in organizations now, is that our normal way of maintaining organizations, since we have most of us have been working remote, or going to be in hybrid remote for a while, we have to figure out different ways to keep those informal networks, because the tendency is to really focus on the people we are directly working with at any given time, rather than having our networks across the organization.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so, oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say, I have found communities of practices, or guilds commonly referred to, as a good vehicle for this.
It can be, as long as they're a community and they practice.
Right.
Yeah, they can be. Yes, it's also important to know who's not with you, and then talk to them. I mean, to find out what their concerns are, because you might learn something super important, super useful, that will help you a lot. And very often, if someone is concerned about a change, bringing them into the fold to say, well, then help us think through the risks. Obviously, you've thought about it, you've got some great concerns, so help us think about them. That bringing them into the fold that way can help a lot. Yeah, so get tapped into the networks if you can find them. Yeah, I think that's a great strategy. Anything else about networks?
I guess just before you move on, I think what we're seeing a lot now in organizations, certainly where I am and a lot of the work I'm doing in the day job, is around the kind of community development piece. So as well as attending to them, it's actually nurturing them and creating them, and so lots of communities of practice, but creating that sense of community, bringing people together through all the things that are good about communities. That's something that we're seeing more of in organizations.
Yeah, because I mean, it's an interesting thing about online meetings is, in some ways they have to be much more structured, just because the cues aren't there, and there's all sorts of reasons that it helps to have meetings be a little more structured. But that also means that the time that people had at the beginning of a meeting or the end of a meeting to just engage in social interaction, or to walk between meetings with people, all of that is gone. So I really do think it takes a lot of attention to nurture networks in the remote or hybrid remote reality. I know of some companies that have been remote for a long time, well before the pandemic, that they sponsor various guilds that have nothing to do with work, but they're a way for people to meet other people from other parts of the organization. And that's how they support some of those networks that are super important for innovation. So they have the guild of the people who brew beer, or the people who smoke meat. I mean, as in making charcuterie, not in smoking meat, but or people who knit, whatever it is, people who do cosplay, anything like that. But it takes a lot more work in the remote world. Experiment. Someone mentioned this earlier about breaking changes down, and there's actually research now that is showing that is actually a good strategy for sustaining change. I'm glad that the research is catching up. But big changes freak people out. They feel like an existential threat. Like, everything is going away forever. Things as I knew it are going away. And that, that's again one of those situations where people get fearful, people hold on. But if you can do experiments, that allows people to learn. It helps them, excuse me, move into that next zone of proximal development, right? Try out some little things, and having little learning curves and little disruptions instead of, you know, a gigantic mountain of learning to climb and, you know, all sorts of disruption all at once. You know, that's when people try to change everything in their organization all at once and things don't go right, and it's inevitable that something's going to go wrong, you end up with a big mess. But if you're doing little experiments, little tiny changes, you know, that help you figure out, is this really the right way? Is this really going to move what we thought it was going to move? You know, if you're looking at one of the factors in your current situation, is this actually going to influence this in the way we hoped it would? You know, that's a learning process, and it engages people and they feel like their fingerprints are on it, and then they own it, right? Then it's theirs. It's not something that's been imposed from the outside. So little tiny changes that allow for learning, I think, are an important strategy. And people often say, well, you know, it will take too long. It'll take too long. But what I find is that it's, in some ways, it's about the same amount of time. It's you just spend your time differently. You know, you spend your time learning and fine tuning and seeing how something moves versus you spend your time explaining, cleaning up, dealing with people who are very upset that they've been pushed into this loss. So you know, it's one of those, you know, you have to choose. Do you want to spend time experimenting, learning, understanding how the system works, and then get a huge payoff, or do you want to try a big bang and then have a big mess if things don't work perfectly, and they never do? So how many of you are doing experiments now? I bet a bunch of you are. I bet a bunch of people are doing experiments.
Yeah. So, like this whole idea of experimentation, what's your experience of organizations that are sort of much more risk averse, and how do you go about trying to really encourage them to embrace experimentation? Because they tend to be quite reluctant.
Well, you know, I think actually experimentation is a risk mitigation strategy, right? Because you're not, you know, the expression in the US is you're not betting the farm, you know, so you're trying something small in a contained way before you try to do it for the whole organization, right? Can you get one team to successfully, you know, deploy on a frequent basis, right? If you can get one team to do it, you stand a chance of having it work in the rest of your organization. You know, if you can get something to work in a small way, you've probably learned a lot about it. So I actually think this is a perfect strategy for companies that are risk averse, because it's super risky to do a big change. It's super costly and it's super risky. I mean, we've all read stories about, you know, the companies that, you know, try to do the agile, and they pay some big consultancy lots of money, and they do all this training, and then, you know, either it fails or they get really disappointing results. Now, that's risky. Trying to get agile to work with one team, you know, trying to see if we can, you know, change the way we collaborate, you know, a little small area, that's not risky, right? That's actually quite a bit less likely to result in huge losses and huge disruption. There seems to be a lot of oh moments, Thomas. Is that
Yes.
like, is that
Just,
like
just as you said, the assumptions that fall to pieces,
yeah,
under a bit of scrutiny that perhaps an experiment would have flushed out.
yeah. So they're avoiding finding that out at scale, right? Find
Yep.
it out in a tiny way. Yeah. Yeah, I think people get scared about experiments because sometimes experiments fail, and we've all seen movies where there's experiments that go horribly awry. But if it's one little team, or one small part of the company, then that's actually far less risky. I think the biggest thing I see with experiments, the biggest issue I see is people want to make them really too big, right? So this actually comes out of healthcare improvement, the literature on healthcare improvement. They have a 2-step down rule of thumb, a heuristic that says, whatever your experiment is, try to take it 2 steps down, or the improvement you're trying to make, try to take it 2 steps. If you think it will take months, can you do something that you might see some results in days? If it's going to take days, can you do something that might take hours? I don't know that you can get much shorter than that, but if it's years, go down to months, go down to weeks. It's weeks, go down to days, go down to hours. So keep them small. We've all been trained to think big and have these big audacious goals, but while there is utility in having a big goal, sometimes when it comes to actually changing an organization, doing it in the small is really helpful. Okay, guide and allow for variation. We have in many ways been brought up to think standardization is the goal and it's most efficient. And it can be when the work is standard, but the work we do in software is not standard, with few exceptions. We're always dealing with novel problems. So I find it is often a struggle for people to think about allowing things to vary, that it doesn't have to be the same in every single part of your organization. It's okay if this team does something slightly different than this team. As long as they aren't impeding each other's work or somebody else's work, it's just fine if they do things differently, because it reflects that there are different teams working on different problems, different people in those teams who have different ways of thinking and bring different backgrounds and skills to them. So I like the analogy of planting an oak. So there are a number of varieties of oak trees, and you have to choose an oak that will actually grow in the conditions that you have. So you don't want to plant a swamp oak on a prairie, and you don't want to plant a savanna oak where the conditions are very wet. You have to look at the match between the environment. So you want oak, but the exact species of oak depends on your situation, the environment you're in. So find out what those boundaries are where, within this we can flex. And they might be pretty narrow if it's something regulatory, but they might be pretty broad if it's not. You just, you need to have a conversation about what that bounded variation is. I think about like, there's a lamp right in front of me behind my computer, and the plug is highly standardized. There's just a handful of ways that plugs plug in any given country. So that's very standardized. The wiring is very standard, based on safety. There are some standards about, how stable is the lamp. But within that standard, you can do anything. And when it comes to the shade, as long as it doesn't catch fire, you can do anything, right? So you have to look at the situation and figure out what are the boundaries, right? You want a particular outcome, and there's some things you don't want, and there's some things that are desirable, but within that, it doesn't have to be standard if the situation isn't standardizable. And I think this is a really tough one, because we have grown up so much with the idea that standardizing is the goal. So how have you run into this issue where you work? How have you run into the issue of allowing for variation?
So I worked in an area whereby Scrum was applied as a blanket approach to getting the work done. And realistically, not all work was complex and adaptive. So that part of the business, this transformation, didn't work out. So
Yep. Yeah, I mean, for some teams, Kanban is a much better fit.
Absolutely.
And, and some teams, some parts of the organization just have projects.
Yeah, spot on.
Yeah. And you need to think about what fits in there.
Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah. I just thought of a story. Oh God, I have a million stories, but I got a call once from somebody he was like a 20-something CEO who wanted to run his entire company on Scrum. And I said, well, what would that look like? And he said, well, all the managers will come to me every day and tell me who is not 100% allocated. And then those people will work on my projects for that day from my backlog. Yeah, it was quite an interesting, quite an interesting understanding of Scrum.
Yeah.
Anyway, but you're absolutely right. Trying to impose that process when the work doesn't fit.
No,
exactly. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah. So Thomas is saying, I think it could link to local cultures, especially in global organizations. Absolutely. There are cultural differences that mean that, that you have to vary how you do things. Like, in cultures where there's a greater power difference, it's not the expectation that junior people are going to speak up may lead you to disappointment, right? When there's a big power difference. So you have to adjust what you do, right? That's just one of them. All sorts of different examples about how that plays out. Who has an example of how that cultural difference might play out? Anyone have an example?
I think you could see it in this call. UK people tend to not contribute as much to an open forum, whereas US voices are quite happy to ask questions.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, and in some cultures, it's actually considered very disrespectful to ask a question in the middle of a talk. So those things show up in hundreds of different ways. Yeah. Yeah, minimum specifications, which is something I've been doing in workshops for years, is a great way to allow for variation to happen. Okay. Use yourself. This is the final heuristic. You are your most important tool for change. Change is a social process, and how you show up matters, right? So if you can hold on to your congruence, if you can bring yourself back in balance when you feel yourself tipping out of it, you can access your empathy, you can access your patience, your observation skills, your ability to reason, your ability to come up with creative ideas, your ability to connect with people. And all of that is really important in making change. You have to change the system, right? But people are in the system. And so you have to attend to their needs. And the more you can show up and connect to people, the easier time of it you're going to have in making a change. There's a lot of research in the world of social science, psychology, clinical social work, that sort of thing, where they can take two people with relatively equivalent educational backgrounds and relatively equivalent professional skills, And what makes a difference in the outcome is how they show up and how they empathize and how they connect with clients. And the same is true with change because it's a social process. So remember that you bring a lot, not just your expertise, not just your knowledge of Agile, not just your domain knowledge, but who you are as a person who can show up authentically and connect with people will have an impact on your ability to bring change. And if you think about it, if you think back through your change experience, I bet you can find some situations where there was somebody who knew a lot, but didn't really succeed in the change because of the way they connected with people. And there are situations where there, may not have had as much expertise, but the way they connected with you, engaged you, and made you interested in it. And they treated you like a human, who was actually going to experience some loss and actually was going to have to learn some things. And that makes all the difference. There's a really lovely story in, I think it was the New Yorker. It's by Atul Gawande, who is a physician and a very good writer. And he wrote about his experience with change, trying to bring new practices to rural maternal hospitals in India. And they tried a whole bunch of different approaches. And the ones that they found were most successful was where someone would go and just be at the hospital and get to know people, get to know the nurses, and work alongside them and help them learn new practices and empathize with the difficulties they experienced. Those were the ones that had good results. And there's just really a beautiful part of the story where they talk to this one nurse who, the person who was sent to coach her group was much younger. She had less experience, but they were quite successful. And she said, when she first came, it felt like she was just putting more work on my head. But after a while, it was like she was my friend. She cared about me. She cared about the work. She cared about the outcome. So don't underestimate how you show up and your characteristics and qualities as a human to help bring change. So, who else has a question at this point?
Yeah, we've got time for one or two quick ones. Conscious of your time, because I know you needed to drop off.
Well, I might be able to stay a couple extra minutes.
I guess just quickly to that last point, I guess a lot of that links into kind of celebrating our uniqueness and just reminding each other and celebrating the fact that actually everybody does bring something different because we are all in fact unique.
Yeah, something unique and special and wonderful. And it's it's not always the same thing.
Any questions, folks, for Esther before she has to drop off? Oh, it just appeared in the chat. It was just the
Esther with a Z. Yeah. So I have a little podcast called Change by Attraction, which expands on some of these ideas and brings in other stuff that isn't in the book. So if you want to listen to the podcast, it's out there at changebyattraction.simplecast.com. And I so appreciate you showing up for this conversation. I really appreciate that you asked questions and that you shared your insights. And yeah, it's been fun.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Thank you, Esther. I think we'll bring it there. I don't want to keep you here longer than you can be here. So thanks for joining.
I can't actually see the time, so I don't know if it's time.
No, I think it's
I'll put on my glasses.
Yeah, there's a few minutes.
I have a couple minutes left. Yeah.
Brilliant. Maybe we can squeeze in one question if there's one last.
Yeah.
Burning question for anyone. Quickly, guys, get Esther while she's still with us. One final question.
Well, and if you think about a question later, just email me. Just remind me where I met you.
This is Sheila. I've had discussions with people quite a few times about whether it's better to do a big bang approach or incremental change. And I've always argued for incremental change, but I wondered, do you have any references to any studies on that?
You know, there was an article recently in the Harvard Business Review that talked about, and I'm not sure I would say it was actually a study. I mean, it was one, I think it was based on one organization, but they do talk about how planning for small changes is much more effective. If you look at the literature on complexity, you're more likely to find that, you know, some kind of stretch and fold cadence where, you know, you stretch to a new thing and then you allow it to fold like you're baking bread, is more effective for actually bringing a change. But I would look to the complexity literature. And if you come across a study, please let me know. I would love to see that.
Yeah, I will look for one. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Thomas asked, what if the networks you need to attend to are dysfunctional? Well, I would try to weave a different network then.
Thank you.
Yeah. You know, so you know, there are sometimes rumor and gossip and negativity networks in companies. And that happens in organizations where people feel beaten down often. So then I would try to find people who do have the energy to work with me and build a network there. Always go with energy, look for allies. Yeah.
I think that's a nice close there. I think look for allies. I love that. Brilliant. I think I'm gonna draw it there with the questions just your time and availability. But yeah, fantastic, great to see you again, and great to have you here.
Thanks for inviting me. It was really lovely to spend my noon and your evening together.
And I should say really thanks for your continued work in the industry and continue to inspire us. So, yeah,
well, I hope to continue for quite a while.
And yeah, it was great to hear you expand on the themes of the book. And I am working through it, but I have to be honest, not as quickly as I'd like. So,
well, it's a slow book. It's not a fast book.
So just before you go, then, would you recommend that somebody could just read one of the rules, like if one was of particular interest, just focusing on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not a book you have to read from cover to cover, you know. I mean, just dip into one and see it and play with it for a while. You know, see where it takes you. You know, just pick one and say, well, maybe I should, you know, figure out why people are doing things the way they're doing and give them some affirmation for that. Or, you know, maybe I should figure out what the bounded variation for this is. So yeah, just pick one and play with it and then tell me what happens.
Brilliant, fantastic. Thanks, Esther. Brilliant.
Okay.
I'm going to give you a little round of applause because I'm unmuted, so you can hear me. There you go. I'm sure everybody appreciated your thoughts and enjoyed hearing from you. So no, thanks again.
Thanks again for inviting me.
Brilliant. Thanks, Esther. So yeah, thanks folks for joining us. Great session. Loved it. Always good to hear from Esther. Just the usual community shout outs and close. So I think you've seen some of our other sessions, but just to do a quick recap, we do have another session for you this month. In August, that's with Chris O'Rourke, and he'll be talking about organizational wellness. So that's later this month. So join us for that if that's of interest to you. And from that point, for those of you who haven't heard before, we're going to start moving to a monthly cadence. So we're going to start doing an event once a month, and then we might switch back at some point next year. See how we go. And if you're a fan of Team of Teams, we've got a treat for you in September. We will be joined by Jerry Osborne, who actually works with the Crystal Group. So that's General Stanley McChrystal's organization. that should be a great session. So if you're a fan of that book, I would definitely encourage you to join us for that session and hear more about those themes and ideas. And then in October, we've got Dana Larson, who is, of course, the co-author of Agile Retrospectives with Esther Derby. So that should be a really good session. We're also big fans of Dana's work. So she'll be talking about the Agile Fluency model, which is kind of where her work is now, in the org she's in, stuff she's doing in the industry. So that should be really exciting stuff. And just, I think last week we mentioned some of the other conferences that are coming up as well. We've got Lean Agile Exchange in October, if you're interested in that, have a look at that. And we also mentioned Daniel Mezek's conference. So you'll see some of that stuff in our LinkedIn group. If you want to go over there and join that, some of that information is promoted there. And there was also a discount code, so you could get a nice little discount if you wanted to go to the leadership conference that Daniel's doing. I think it's next week, actually. And I'll also be speaking at Lean Agile Edinburgh's event next week. If you want to come and hear me on the other side of the screen, talking about my passion for social leadership, be great to see you there. And I think that's it. So delighted to have you here. Thanks for joining us, and I hope you found that useful. And look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care, look after yourselves, folks. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are.
Hey, Sath, which one, the last one you mentioned?
Which one? Sorry.
The last one.
My one?
When? Yeah, the last one. When is it?
Yeah, the next Wednesday. So it's in Lean Agile Edinburgh.
Okay.
I'm speaking at Lean Agile Edinburgh. I'm talking about social leadership. So,
I would love to see the link to that one.
yeah,
If
sure.
you-
I'll message you. I'll send it to you.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody.
Good to see you.
Great session.
Okay, thanks everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.